Welcome to Bookaholics, the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking's podcast series dedicated to books. In this series, we introduce you to some recent and relevant books, our own books, and obviously classic books that we just can't stop talking and teaching about. My name is Kristof Vanhoutte, and in this episode of Bookaholics, it is my great pleasure to be joined by Benedict Beckeld to talk about his latest book, Western Self-Contempt, Oikophobia in the Decline of Civilizations, published by Cornell University Press. Hello, Benedict, and welcome.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Now, as people familiar with Bookaholics know by now, we always give the first word to the author. As you wrote the book, who better than you to tell us what it is about and what you hope to achieve with it? So please.
Yes, so the book is about the central concept of oikophobia, which you mentioned in the title, which is neologism, more or less. It was coined by the late Sir Roger Scruton about 25 years ago, as the opposite extreme of xenophobia. So oikophobia, from the Greek oikos, meaning home or house, refers to cultural self-hatred, a hatred of one's own or contempt of one's own civilization, of one's own society on a cultural level. And so it's about, the book is about why this happens. Now, most of us probably in the Western world, both in Europe and in North America, we're familiar with the phenomenon. We've seen it in action. But most people don't have a very clear idea of why we are in such a historical phase where this sort of thing happens. Because this kind of cultural self-hatred doesn't always happen. It hasn't been the case in every era. And so my book tries to explain why it happens, the circumstances, socio-historical and philosophical reasons behind cultural self-hatred. And so, yeah, that's basically what the book is about. As for your question, what I hope to achieve with it, to be perfectly honest, I probably will maybe talk a little bit about my general attitude toward the society in which we live, but I have a rather pessimistic, one might say, attitude about the things I talk about, and so I don't really think, even if I wanted to achieve something, I don't really think I can achieve anything with it. Yeah, it's and first of all, probably because most people won't even know about the book. Of course, this podcast might help a bit, but
we do our best.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, let's hope. But I wrote it mainly just because I felt I had to, I think a lot of, not just philosophers and writers, just creative people in general, I think will understand what I mean when I say that you do something because you have to. You engage in your craft because you have to. It's my calling in life. So I just wrote it because these ideas came to me, sort of formed themselves in my mind, and so I had to sit down and write them out. And that's really the only reason I wrote them. Of course, if down the line some people do read it and are inspired by it or they gain something from it, of course, I'll be very happy if that happens.
Okay.
But really, I just wrote it because I had to.
No great expectations.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I read the book, so at least one person read it.
Yes, exactly.
Now, in order to make sure that all listeners perfectly understand what we are talking about, you already said a little bit about the concept of oikophobia, but could you say something more about it? You also mentioned that it doesn't always occur, so there must be a historical aspect in your talk as well. So what can you say a bit more so that the listener can understand specifically more what we are talking about?
Yeah, so it's something that happens during particular phases in history. Oikophobia is not a constant, unlike xenophobia, which is the polar opposite of oikophobia, as I mentioned. Xenophobia, you can always, in every era, I think in every society, you can always find people who are xenophobic, sometimes more, sometimes fewer. But you will always find some people who dislike foreigners, who hate other civilizations, and so on. Oikophobia is something that is a bit more cyclical. Now, xenophobia can also happen as a reaction toward oikophobia. So xenophobia is also not always the same. It does vary in degree and intensity and so on. But oikophobia is something much more cyclical. So it generally happens in the society, and a big part of the book is that I go back to ancient times, all the way back to ancient Greece, and then also Rome as well, and look at the circumstances under which oikophobia tends to occur. And I do that because if we see how it happened in ancient times, that will help us understand how it's happening right now. So basically, just to obviously I spend many pages on this, but briefly, a society that has grown prosperous and safe, secure, that has time for leisure, for science, for various intellectual studies. That's a society that will be prone to orcophobia, because a society that has those, that is enjoying those advantages, will become introspective. Mm-hmm. And so it will start to look at itself and start to criticize itself. And self-critique in and of itself is not a bad thing, of course. But human beings being human beings, we have a tendency of taking everything to an extreme. Mm-hmm. And so the self-critique will lead to orcophobia, where you don't just have reasonable measured critique of your own civilization, but you really start to despise it. And so that happens when a civilization has matured, and we see, so that's why I say it's cyclical, because then at the beginning of the next civilization, there is no orcophobia. Okay. And so it reappears cyclically in history.
Okay. So two things I'd like to remark here. First of all, you already mentioned it, that you put it against xenophobia. And in your book, I really liked the remark you put there, as you use the example of the balance, of the virtue balance that Aristotle wrote in the Nicomacheanetics, and that you say that virtues are the middle ground between two extremes, and you use orcophobia and xenophobia as the non-virtues extremes. So I really like that. So that would be a first comment, if you maybe in a second comment on that as well. But then also, this is not the first time that the people I talk to remind me of one of Ivan Illich's wonderful ideas, and that of the two watersheds. And so I think I find it here again in what you say. So you have a civilization that criticizes itself, and that's the first watershed, but that's a good thing. But then comes the second watershed, and that's when a good thing turns bad. So I think here the orcophobia is then the self-critique is no longer critical, but is damaging. Do you think that's a good remark here? Or?
Yeah, essentially, I would qualify it slightly, but I basically agree. But so as to your point about Aristotle, so let me start with the second point, since that's freshest in my mind. So basically, the if we look at it in a general way, self-critique is good because it can help a civilization to grow and to learn from its mistakes, of course. I think that's pretty obvious why self-critique can be a very useful thing. And generally, self-contempt is a bad thing because it's purely destructive. Self-critique attempts to be constructive. Mm-hmm. The one reason I said that I would qualify what you said a little bit is that since, as I try to establish in the book, orcophobia is something that happens cyclically, we see that self-critique does lead to self-contempt. And so self-critique taken in and of itself, I would certainly say is a good thing, and that's something some other people who have read the book previously, they think that I want a society where everyone is the same and nobody questions anything. Of course, that's not at all what I want. I'm just pointing out in a descriptive way, and that's another thing. A lot of people can't tell the difference between description and prescription, right? The fact that I describe a problem, right? It doesn't mean that I want to say that, therefore we should all be like a tribe where everybody thinks the same thing. Not at all. Simply describing the process by which self-critique does lead to self-contempt. Critique is good, but we also have to keep in mind the cyclical aspect of it, that it does tend to be taken too far. And so even though you see and you welcome self-critique, you also see clearly in history what the next step will be after that. So now I forgot about the Aristotle part. So as you said, he says, he talks about it's in book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about how a virtue is the moderate middle ground between two extremes, and of course the whole point about the middle ground is very important. Aristotle in other contexts as well, when he talks about the middle class in a society, for example, the golden mean is a big thing. If self-critique, you mentioned, we've just been talking about self-critique. Now I think we can agree that self-critique, by and large, in spite of the qualification I mentioned, self-critique by and large is a good thing. But if you have too much self-critique, right, then you become orcophobic. And if you have too little self-critique, you might become xenophobic. And so self-critique would be a virtuous middle between those two extremes. And similarly, self-promotion too, right? It's good to take care of your own civilization, to promote your own society. But too much of that becomes xenophobic, and again, too little of that becomes orcophobic. And so once again, I think Aristotle is right, and I think division. Aristotle is right, tends to be right about a lot of things.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thanks. So maybe a short follow-up question on that. Do you think there is any form of oikophobia that is acceptable? Or let me maybe say it somewhat differently. Can it be considered acceptable at times?
No, not really, because I think oikophobia by its very nature is unreflective, as opposed to self-critique. Oikophobia is where one simply seeks to denigrate. Like I said before, I don't think it has a constructive purpose. One could, I suppose, say that if there is too much xenophobia in a society at a particular point, oikophobia could serve as a counterweight.
Okay.
And maybe in that sense, it could one could see some use in it. Similarly, if there's too much oikophobia in a society, maybe some xenophobia would serve as a counterweight. But I still can't say that I think oikophobia or xenophobia themselves are good things. The self-critique that leads to oikophobia, that in itself, of course, can be very useful.
Okay. But on its own, you don't think it has any?
Yeah. Okay. No, not really. I wouldn't think so. If it does, I'm not sure I would call it oikophobia. I guess I would have to see a case in history where this sort of self-denigration has a positive outcome, but I don't see one.
Okay, thanks. Now, one more question regarding oikophobia. Obviously, you wrote the book about it, so it's good that we talk about it. Now, it seems to be a highly elitarian issue, or better, an issue that is mainly present in the higher cultural echelons. The main protagonist of your book are the great names of philosophy and literature in Western history. Can you say something more about this seemingly elitarian character or aspect of oikophobia?
Yeah, so that's largely true, indeed, that it is an elitist or elitarian phenomenon. That's more true in the ancient world, though, than in the modern. And I talk a little bit in the book about the reasons for that. The fact that it's the elite, I mentioned before that, once a society is able to establish a measure of leisure and science and self-study and so on, it becomes more self-critical and ultimately more oikophobic. It should be clear, right, that it's the elite that is able to begin with to engage in science and self-study and so on. And so for that reason alone, it tends to be an elitist or elitarian phenomenon. Now, the reason why that changes a little bit over time, it's still to a considerable extent an elitarian phenomenon today, but it has become more diffuse. And the reason for that is that the more democracy, the more egalitarianism we find in a society, the more oikophobia we tend to find there. And that's, by the way, why we see it first in ancient Greece, because ancient Greece has the first democracy in the Western world, not necessarily what we would call democracy today, but certainly by an ancient standard, a democratic form of government in Athens. And so we see oikophobia appear there because if you have a highly authoritarian kind of a government or a social system, there is very little room for self-questioning. But egalitarianism and democracy, an open intellectual space where people are not afraid to question and to self-criticize, that's the kind of space where oikophobia occurs. And because we have more of that in modern times than they did in ancient times, right? We have more egalitarianism, more democratization, at least democracy in an egalitarian sense. We have more of that today, right, than in the ancient world. Because of that, we also have more oikophobia. And so for that reason, the elitarian phenomenon of oikophobia has become non-elitarian as well. You can see, and I talk a little bit about the book, about the sort of this movement of oikophobia, that with every new iteration of oikophobia in history, it becomes a little more diffuse. Rome is kind of an exception to that, actually. I also talk about why, but essentially, if you look at the British Empire, oikophobes in the British Empire, you see that it starts to go a little bit into the middle and lower classes. Not a lot, but a bit. Whereas in ancient Athens, for example, it had really been an elitarian phenomenon. Just the intellectuals had engaged in it. And now in modern times, right, in modern Western Europe and in present-day United States, because we're so extremely egalitarian and so focused on equality, not just among ourselves, but between us and other nations, for that reason, oikophobia has become more diffuse. And so now you can meet people right and left, well, not right and left in the in a political sense, but in the sense of everywhere, you meet people. Right, exactly. I realize that could be misunderstood what I just said. It's still, of course, mostly a left-wing phenomenon. But you meet people everywhere who are not necessarily in academia, who just are sort of regular people. They went to public school and they learned certain things from their teachers, and they just assume that, yes, of course, Western civilization is guilty of a great many crimes, and other civilizations have been brutalized by us, and so on and so forth. So while it is still more of an elitarian phenomenon, and I talk a little bit in the book about that it's, you're likelier to find oikophobia in a university town in Massachusetts than in a farming town in the middle of Kansas, for example. But nonetheless, we do see, because of increased egalitarianism, because of increased democratization, it has ceased to be a purely elitarian phenomenon. So yeah, the elitism of oikophobia is certainly there, but it has changed over time.
Okay. Now, a follow-up question here. It was already clear that oikophobia is put against xenophobia. Now, if oikophobia, even if it's a little bit less elitarian, can one say it still is, like you just said, it still has the elitarian aspects to it? But if it is so for the elitarian aspect of oikophobia, can then one say that xenophobia is an essential, or was an essential part of the non-elite? Or can't one go that far?
Yeah, I would maybe, to some extent, yes, I would maybe remove the word essential there, because I don't think it has to be the case. Just like I would say that oikophobia is not essential to the elite, right? You can certainly find the elite, of course, that are not. But yes, there's certainly the tendency, once again, that the non-elite would be more xenophobic. And in fact, in the book I list, I think it's at the end of chapter 9, if I remember correctly, I have a 10-point list where I actually say very specifically, these are the historical reasons and the socio-philosophical reasons, very concretely, why the elites tend to be the most oikophobic. And so the reverse of that is true, right? Because those 10 points that I give are lacking among the non-elite, they would tend to be more xenophobic. I get very specific about that. But there is certainly the tendency, because they have less access to fashions and ideas from abroad, and so they're less likely to be seduced by them. They live in a state of civilization, the non-elite, that is, they live in a state of civilization that tends to harken back to the earlier, more traditional ways of a civilization. They tend to live outside of the cities, where mores and customs don't change as quickly as they do in the cities. So there are many different reasons for why they would be less oikophobic and even more xenophobic than the elite. There is, however, one tendency which I do also discuss in the book, which we also see across civilizations in ancient and modern times, that the non-elite, although you find it to some extent among the elite as well, but there is that tendency, especially among the non-elite, that they become so distraught with what happens to their own societies through oikophobia that they begin to hate their own civilizations for that reason, in a reactionary way, right? And so it's not the same as regular oikophobia, right? But it does become a sort of self-hate because they don't recognize anymore the civilization in which they live. And so, and in fact, you even see this today to some extent, right? If to take a very, very recent example, you have some people in the United States who are so disgusted by what is happening with the United States that they start hating the United States, and they start loving the enemies of the United States, or what some people at least would consider the enemies of the United States, such as Russia, for example, right? So now you have some people so that's what I call reactionary oikophobia. They praise Vladimir Putin, they praise Russia, and they hate the United States because they think that Russia is more like what the United States used to be, whereas the United States has become something else. And so there is that element of reactionary oikophobia to keep in mind as well. So those are all qualifications basically to what you said, but I think you're basically right in identifying that, yes, the non-elite does, by and large, tend to be more xenophobic, or at least non-oikophobic.
Now, just something that it popped up, like if there's the elite and the non-elite, and one is the more oikophobic, the other is the more xenophobic, where are the virtuous people?
Right, yes, that's a good question. Yeah,
Okay.
I look for them as well, just like Diogenes walking around with a lamp in ancient Athens, looking for virtuous people.
Okay, so it's this difficult, you think?
Yes, well, he was very obnoxious, as I say in the book as well. Well, I think the virtuous people, not to be too self-aggrandizing here, but I hope that we and the people listening can create something of a community of virtue anyway, in which because we actually approach and discuss these issues, even if we don't agree on everything, the mere fact that we're able to discuss them, I think, is a virtuous thing.
Yeah, I agree. Now, entering a bit more into a technical issue, you say that your book is not a historical one, and indeed it is clearly a philosophical one, but history does play a fundamental role in it. Now, the historical process that stands at the center of the book is that of a cyclical repetition, or better, you claim that you say that it's a helical one, and I think that's quite interesting. Now, this, as you also clearly admit, should remind one of the tragic Greek vision of the world. Now, if I get it right, this seems to be an attempt and a desire to go beyond the contemporary, what one can call crypto-religious narrative of progress, and I could not agree with you more here. However, at times this, if I may call it a neo-Greek vision, seems rather bleak. It seems like a doomed cause and effect determinism. I think that history, even history that goes beyond and even against the superficial and simplistic narrative of progress, can be told in a less deterministic way. Now, first of all, am I portraying your historical narrative correctly of the cyclical repetition and then the helical one? And secondly, maybe you would like to comment on the telling history in a less deterministic way as well.
I would agree that your description is accurate. The only thing I'd say is that I'm a little cautious about the word determinism or deterministic, because a lot of people have the tendency of understanding that word in a very fatalistic way. Sort of, it doesn't matter what we do, just people throw up their arms in the air and say, okay, well, let's just hope for the best. Everything will happen the same way anyway, regardless of what we do. So that's part of the reason why I wrote the epilogue to the book, to say that in spite of the seemingly deterministic view of history, it does in fact matter a lot what we do, and I explain in the epilogue philosophically, I think, why that's the case. But more or less, your description is correct. I would just issue that caveat to anyone who listens. But as for your other point about a very bleak, that it's a sort of a bleak view of history or of the development of oikophobia. Yes, I mean, I would agree with that as well. And I guess this is the case where I would say that, we're philosophers, of course, we're not politicians. And so it's not our job to say things that sound good or pleasant to anyone who wishes to listen. And I think actually this is a big problem. One always has there's always the temptation to deliver good news, and you see this with a lot of famous public intellectuals today. They sort of have their fan base, and so they become beholden to their own fan base. Their fan base become like their voters, basically, and they have to say nice things. They flatter their listeners, they flatter their viewers and readers, and this is something we have to resist, I think, as philosophers. There's a reason why many societies have executed philosophers or banished them, right? We're often not popular because we don't. It's not our job to deliver good news because we're not politicians. So the fact that something that it sounds bleak, I don't think it's an argument against it. I'm not saying you're not saying that it is an argument against it.
No.
I'm just saying that I think we have to kind of resist that temptation. The one thing, it's to sort of resist that politicization of our own work, where because it is our job to deliver the truth as to the best of our ability, at least as we see it. The one thing I guess I could say on the more positive side, not that I want to now give in to this temptation, of course, but on a little more positive way, is that you can tell a story of a society in many ways, right? And I make this point in chapter 9 of the book, where I talk about the fact that when I talk about oikophobia, I'm not talking about all of history. It's not a total history, right? So I'm talking about oikophobia. And yes, I do have to say that when we look at history, at the oikophobic element in the rise and fall of civilizations, that is a very bleak story. But I also say that there are other aspects in history, obviously beyond oikophobia, of course, many, many more aspects, and some of those aspects might yield a more positive story. And the other books exist about some of those aspects, and I think those are also worth reading. So we can certainly find more positive stories when we look at history. But the story of oikophobia is a pretty bleak one, unfortunately. And so I try to tell it to the best of my ability.
And a bleak story can also be an alarm sign that people might actually look up a bit and see that some of these things that were happening in the past are present again, and that if you continue up until a certain point, there is this thing called the slippery slope, and once you're on it, it's going to go downwards afterwards. So.
Yes, exactly. I just published an article called On Slippery Slopes, actually, the other day, so it's funny you should mention it. Okay. Just plugging my own work. I'm sorry.
I'm ripping you off. Anyway, yes. To conclude, reading your book, it becomes clear at times that the publication process of it was not very smooth. In the introduction, you also phrase your displeasure with this rather explicitly. Now, I have to say that besides it being a sad confirmation of so many other experienced and confessed stories of betrayal of the core scope of academic publishing, this type of problems, however, touches me deeply. Now, I come from a different background than you, and more than once did I disagree with your book, as with all the other books that have passed the review here at Bookaholics. But that is exactly what I think a book should do, especially philosophical books. I should find points of disagreement, and I should feel uncomfortable at times. Anyway, do you want to say something more about the difficulties you encountered, and maybe also then in the end about the positive fact that your book did see the light of day in the end?
Yes, so there's much I could say here. I guess I'll have to hold myself back a little bit because some things I could say would involve other people whose privacy should be protected. But basically, I can say that the Cornell University Press was which published the book was actually the second press that brought the book to a peer review process. There was another academic publisher that had also accepted it for peer review, and the peer reviews that I received back, they were anonymous, right? So I don't know who they were written by, but the couple of peer reviews I received back from that earlier publisher were so brutal. It wasn't, and the thing is, and that's the thing, right? It's of course it's perfectly fine to disagree. Even the peer reviews for Cornell University Press, they had some points of disagreement that they raised. So disagreement, of course, is fine. But that earlier round of peer reviews didn't actually even care to discuss my actual arguments. I was basically just called a fascist, not that exact word, but you read between the lines. That's basically what they were saying. Okay. And so, of course, that other academic publisher couldn't carry the project forward. And there was no attempt at even philosophical argumentation. I was just basically shut out. And so there's one example. I mean, there are other examples as well. I mean, more generally, I mean, when you send a book like this to academic publishers, so many of them let you know right away that you're not welcome among them, and so most of the time I'd sent it to a number of academic publishers, and most of them they don't say it explicitly, also because they don't want it to be on the record why you're being rejected, but it's very clear. You read between the lines, it's very clear that you don't need to bother with such things. If they see the name Roger Scruton, right, who's a famous conservative, of course. They see that he coined this term oikophobia right away. They're not interested. I don't actually consider myself a conservative, and there are many reasons for that. But obviously, there are certain elements in the book that can be called conservative, and so right away they will reject it. So it took a long time to really find people who were willing to support the project. And again,
to engage with the argument, maybe.
Exactly, to engage with the argument, which in and of itself shouldn't be something unusual, but unfortunately it has become very unusual. Again, like I said, I mean, you and I, as you said, you disagree with certain things in the book, but we're sitting here and having a conversation about it. That's a very unusual thing now.
It used to be the whole point of philosophy.
Right.
Nobody agrees with anybody. That's why you have all different philosophers.
Exactly. No, I remember this. The philosophy department in Tübingen a few hundred years ago, right? They had one staircase up for the realists and one staircase up for the nominalists, and they didn't talk to each other, right? So it's a typical philosophy thing, but we're supposed to be able to interact anyway.
Exactly.
But yeah. So and then again, there are also some more personal stories just about how people refused to engage with it and so on, and how I was not just rejected but insulted in the process on a more personal level. So, so there is all of that. But on the positive side, again, as you say, it did see the light of day in the end. And so, and this gives me hope as well. And I hope that anyone who listens who feels frustrated with academia, that it might give them a little bit of hope as well. I found an acquisitions editor at Cornell who is very open-minded, and again did not necessarily agree with everything, but was open-minded enough to be interested in the argument and to engage with it and go through the editing process with me. And Cornell, of course, it is a major university press, and so it's so that was very heartwarming, I have to say. And of course, it's always the terrible it's always the big stories, the big negative stories that make all the headlines, right? When a speaker gets shut out or is disinvited or something like this, it's never the positive stories. All hope is not lost for academia.
No, all hope is not lost.
Exactly. There is room for dissent and for conversations like this one.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Benedict. And for all those who want to have a closer look at Benedict's book, it is called Western Self-Contempt, Oikophobia in the Decline of Civilization, published by Cornell University Press. Thanks again for talking to me, Benedict. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. The pleasure has been mine.
Thanks also to our listeners for having joined us once again here at PICT, at Bookaholics. And you, dear listeners, if you like our volunteer work here at PICT, you can also consider supporting us by becoming an active member of our institution. For more information how to join PICT, please visit our website. And if you wish to contribute to this series dedicated to books, maybe by proposing a recent book or even simply by recording your own episode of Bookaholics, please do get in touch. My name is Kristof Vanhoutte. Thank you and goodbye.